This week's Fireside Bible story is one of a hero that's so familiar, even the Grateful Dead wrote a song about him. But if you grew up in Sunday school, you know Samson is a great hero of the faith that had one minor moment of weakness that temporarily pulled him away from a very close and faithful relationship with God. That makes for a very nice Sunday school story, but Samson was no man of God. At least not until the last days of his life. If you've been following the stories from the book of Judges, you may have noticed that there's a pattern that is emerging, a pattern of unfaithfulness. The people of Israel stray from God in favor of foreign gods. Then Israel's oppressed by foreign invaders. Then Israel cries out to God, and he raises a judge that liberates them and rules over them for a short period. Rinse, lather, repeat. With the story of Samson, though, there's no cry to God for deliverance. Israel is acquiesced to Philistine rule. And this could be because the Philistines were benevolent rulers, or it could just be that Israel had become so callous to God that they didn't even consider asking him for help. Either way, we're going to find there's only one person of faith in the entire story, and that's Samson's mother. And interestingly, she remains unnamed, and in the grand scheme of things, really only appears in a cameo role. The wife of Manoah, a man of the tribe of Dan, had finally given up. She'd accepted the fact that she was barren and would have no children. For many months, she'd prayed to the Lord to give her a child, but maybe that was the problem. All the Israelites had been worshiping the Philistine god, Dagon, for decades. She remembered some of the people of her tribe that worshiped some nameless god when she was younger. He had a few different titles, like Elohim, which meant God Most High, or sometimes they just called him Yahweh, or the Lord. But once her grandparents' generation had all died out, the recognition of this nameless God had quickly disappeared. Why spend time trying to curry favor with a nameless, invisible God? Dagon had proven himself to be the tantamount God long before the Philistines had taken over leadership of the Israelite people 40 years ago. But to this woman, there had always been something about the nameless God that her grandparents had referred lovingly to as the Lord. It seemed, at least in the tribe of Dan, that she'd been the only person who'd kept Yahweh as her God. But now he'd let her down. Perhaps everyone was right. Perhaps if she'd been praying and sacrificing to Dagon, she would have a child. All the other girls that she'd grown up with reveled in the opportunity to finally offer their bodies as a sacrifice to Dagon when the Philistine men came. Dagon, like so many other pagan gods, demanded sacrifice as a temple prostitute. But this woman always had a nagging feeling that Yahweh was somehow telling her that she, and all of these other girls as well, were worth more than that. So she'd kept her purity intact, and maybe that was the mistake that made her shamefully childless. But one day, she was at her daily chores, and a very strange man approached. He had the appearance of a son of man, but there was something divine about him. You see, she went to the well for the day's water in the afternoon to avoid the judgmental stares and whispering about her barrenness. And this stranger walked right up to her at the well and sat down and asked for some water. Even though it was borderline improper for her to speak with this strange man, she complied. Then the stranger spoke to her very pointedly. "You're barren." Well, how could he know that? You will conceive a son. And the emotions of all this were overwhelming. Who was this man to come and say to her these things? Now be careful not to drink wine or strong drink, or eat anything unclean, for you shall conceive and bear a son. And no razor will come on his head, for the boy shall be a Nazarite to God from birth. It is he who shall begin the deliverance of Israel from the hand of the Philistines. What could this all mean? This man seemed to know everything about her. He seemed to be able to see directly into her soul. And what was all this about being a Nazarite? She vaguely remembered something that sounded similar to that from her childhood. It seemed to have something to do with setting oneself apart in service of Yahweh. And now this messenger of Yahweh had come and spoken to her. Strange. She spent the rest of the day in kind of a daze. And as she was telling her husband, Manoah, about the encounter that evening, she still couldn't quite believe it. As they were sitting down to dinner, she was finishing her story. And then he told me that I shouldn't drink any wine or strong drink or eat anything unclean because our son was going to be a Nazarite. It was strange, but I know that he came from Yahweh. Something about him seemed to make everything about his actions and his words. I don't know, this sounds crazy, but he seemed to somehow be the living embodiment of the word of Yahweh. I don't understand it. But he was more than just a messenger. Manoah was pretty uninterested in the whole thing, mostly because he didn't understand how some divine being would come to a woman rather than directly to him. I mean, it was going to be his son after all. And what kind of God reveals himself to a woman when he could come directly to the husband? His wife saw his disbelief and implored him to pray, to ask her God to make Manoah understand. And in a half-hearted, almost condescending tone, Manoah asked his wife's God to send this man of God to him so that he might understand the needs for this son that they're going to have. The next day, the woman was in the field, and the messenger returned. She immediately ran inside and got her husband. And he kind of rolled his eyes, but he followed her to the field. He was skeptical until he saw the man. And then he had immediately the same reaction that his wife had. This was no ordinary man. He asked in an awestruck voice, "Are you the man who spoke with this woman?" And the stranger simply replied, "I am." He spoke his response in an even tone, but somehow it had the force and the volume of the rushing waters. Manoah's wife's eyes went wide with shock. Immediately, she flashed back in her mind to a story from her childhood. I am. Wasn't that the name that Yahweh had given Moses when Moses asked the burning bush for the name of the God that would deliver Israel from Egypt? Well, Manoah's tone had changed completely. Suddenly, the son that they were going to have seemed to be more of a reality rather than an empty promise. What should we do concerning this son that you have promised us? The stranger simply said, "Well, the woman needs to heed the instructions that I've already given her. She's to observe everything that I've commanded her." Well, that did it. Manoah was convinced that he was in the presence of God, the real God, not some stone statue of a fish man that was essentially a stone excuse for the people of Israel to engage in every kind of debauchery that came to their minds. Well, allow us to detain you and honor you by preparing a meal of a kid goat for you. If you detain me, I will not eat the food that you prepared. But if you want to prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to Jehovah, the Lord God." Not to be deterred, Manoah continued to press him. "At least tell us your name, so that when these things come true, we can honor your name." "Why do you ask my name?" "It's too wonderful." Manoah and his wife were struck by a sudden sense that "wonderful counselor" was a very apt way of describing this man. He had a name that only he knew. And his appearance, with his hair as white as snow and eyes that seemed to have fire in them, let Manoah know that he'd already pressed this man as far as he dared. Manoah prepared the kid goat and a grain offering right there on the spot and offered them up to Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God Most High, who works wonders. As the flames went up to heaven from the makeshift altar, the man of God began to ascend into heaven. Manoah and his wife fell face down on the ground in fear. Manoah shouted to his wife, "We shall surely die, for we have seen God." But his wife, who had been pondering all of these things in her heart, had a sense of peace that she couldn't understand or even begin to explain. But she answered him and said, "If the Lord had meant to kill us, He would not have accepted our burnt offering and grain offering. He would not have shown us these great things or told us of the great things to come." Just as the man of God had foretold, Manoah's wife gave birth to a son, and they named him Samson. The Lord blessed the child, and his spirit began to stir once again in Israel. Despite the miraculous circumstances of his conception and birth, however, Samson was no man of God. If anything, he was at best a Hebrew patriot, but nothing more. But his patriotism was only skin deep because he had a weakness for the Philistine women. When Samson was a young man, he visited a town called Timnah. Like so many young men in their late teens or early 20s, Samson was more driven by hormones than reason. He saw a woman there and immediately fell in love with her. And he told his parents that he desired to have this woman as his wife. He all but demanded that his father make it happen. And they both implored him, both of his parents, to reconsider. And they said, "Is there not a woman from among our people that you must go out and take a wife from these uncircumcised Philistines?" To say that Samson was spoiled by his parents, partly due to the miraculous circumstances of his birth, is to put it mildly. He demanded, "Get her for me because she pleases me." And his parents reluctantly complied. And he brought his parents to Timnah, and as he was in the vineyard alone, he was suddenly attacked by a young lion. The Spirit of the Lord just as suddenly overtook Samson, and he tore the beast apart with his bare hands. Strangely, he told no one of this great feat. But he immediately went and found the woman that he was there to take as his wife, and told her his intention, and she was pleased. So, having a deal in principle, Samson and his family returned home after making plans to come and retrieve his bride at a future date, which was the custom. But when Samson returned a few weeks later, he saw the carcass of the lion that he'd killed. And when he came upon it, he saw that it was covered with a swarm of bees, and that they had built a hive inside. Well, ignoring the bees, he broke open the beehive inside the lion that he'd killed, and he scraped the honey out and he ate it. Well, Samson was just beginning to come to realize the superhuman abilities that he possessed. And he thoughtlessly brought home some of the honey to his mother and his father, and they ate it too. Now, this all seems innocuous, but part of the Nazirite vow that Samson was supposed to be living by entailed him not touching something that was dead because it was unclean. He not only touched the unclean carcass, but he'd eaten out of it. And now his mother, who was also instructed to eat nothing unclean, had unknowingly done so as well. Thinking nothing about what he'd done, Samson made a great feast to celebrate his new bride. It was well attended by both Hebrews and Philistines alike. And being perhaps a little bit too overconfident in his intellectual and physical prowess, and wanting to show up as Philistine guests, Samson proposed a riddle to all that were in attendance. He said, "If you can answer my riddle at the end of the 7 days of feasting, I will reward you with 30 linen garments and 30 festal garments. But if you cannot answer in that time, you must pay me with 30 linen and 30 festal garments." Well, the Philistines couldn't refuse their host, even though they felt like this was maybe a trap. Samson's riddle was this: out of the eater came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. 3 days went by, and the Philistines were no closer to coming to an answer. They came to Samson's wife in secret and forcefully told her to give them the answer. She was, after all, a Philistine herself, or had she completely gone over to the Israelites in the 3 days that she'd been married to one? She went to her husband and wept, saying that she needed to know the answer to this riddle to prove his love for her. Samson scoffed and said, "I haven't told my father or my mother. Why would I tell you?" His reply to his wife's tears were very cold-hearted, but she persisted. Finally, on the 7th day of the feast, Samson relented. It was not out of concern for his new wife or care for her emotional well-being. He was just sick of the noise, an issue that would eventually be his downfall. But on this occasion, it only cost him a small fortune in worldly goods. He answered his wife, "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Well, his new wife immediately went and told the Philistines the answer, and they came to Samson with the answer for the riddle. Samson was furious, and in a tirade that was full of intentional double entendre, he scoffed at the Philistines. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have found the answer to my riddle." In his rage, the Spirit of the Lord came on him. He went to the Philistine city of Ashkelon and killed 30 men there in a fit of rage, and he took their spoil. He used this to pay his debts to the men at the feast, but he did not return. He went to his father's house to cool off. His marriage was over before it began. But this would certainly not be the last time that Samson got himself in trouble with a Philistine woman.
You read about Samson, all from his birth. He was the strongest man that has lived on earth.